My parents didn't just take my college fund, they erased me. At 16, I found myself staring at a one-way plane ticket to Ironwood Summit Military Academy. They called me a distraction and handed my future to Brielle, their soccer prodigy. I remember that night like a frozen photograph, the dining room cold, silent except for my father's voice, calm but cutting. Brielle's talent deserves the best university, he said. My carefully saved college fund would pay for it. When I spoke up, my mother looked at me with a chill I still feel in my bones. You lack direction. Ironwood will fix you. That was all. The next morning, my bags were packed. I barely got a goodbye. My father's final words echoed like a curse. Don't make a scene, Kai. Be useful for once. Ironwood Summit was brutal. The walls were gray, looming, unyielding. Every day tested more than strength. It tested mind, patience, and will. I was nobody's brother, nobody's burden here. The officers were sharp-eyed, the schedules merciless, and every misstep punished with cold precision. But in that cruelty, I found clarity. I focused on academics, honing logic and strategy until they became instinct. Amid the harshness, I found allies, the first being Jax, a boy with his own scars from a broken home. We understood each other without words, finding strength in silence. Major Vance, a strict but fair officer, noticed my persistence. He became a mentor, showing me that discipline and intelligence could be a weapon. Birthday cards came from my parents, always obligatory, always cold, always filled with Brielle's accomplishments. I never responded. Years passed. I earned a full ROTC scholarship and a degree in computer engineering while working 2 jobs to survive. I heard through a friend that Brielle had burned out injuries, partying, failing grades. My parents never told me. That news did not bring relief. It only cemented the resolve growing inside me. I graduated top of my class, leaving behind the shadow of my family's betrayal. Jax and I started a small cybersecurity firm, Sentinel Core, which grew steadily, fueled by focus, strategy, and trust. Elena, a brilliant programmer, saw me for who I was. Within 5 years, Sentinel Core became a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I hired a private investigator and learned my parents were nearly bankrupt, still funding Brielle's aimless life. The next chapter would be my reckoning. They would see the man they discarded, now untouchable, while they were trapped in their own failures. I didn't need anger or confrontation. Success, patience, and strategy were my revenge. In every quiet victory, I held the power they had denied me, and soon, they would understand that the boy they cast aside had become a man they could never afford to face. Ironwood Summit was nothing like I had imagined. The first weeks felt endless early mornings, harsh drills, strict rules, and teachers who demanded perfection in everything. Every corner of the academy seemed designed to test patience, endurance, and intelligence. At first, I felt small, invisible, like a shadow in a world that didn't care about me. But slowly, the constant challenge sharpened my mind. I discovered a talent for solving problems, especially those that required logic and careful thinking. Numbers, patterns, strategies. They became tools I could trust when people around me were unpredictable or cruel. It was during one of the long study sessions that I met Jax. He was quiet, observant, carrying a weight in his eyes. I recognized immediately. Like me, he had come from a family that failed to understand him. At first, we barely spoke, only exchanging looks across the crowded classroom or in the mess hall. But over time, our silence became a language of its own. We learned to watch each other's backs, offering small gestures of support when no one else would. Friendship at Ironwood Summit was not about laughter or comfort, it was survival. We pushed each other, sharing strategies for handling drills, studying, and enduring the relentless discipline. Major Vance noticed me as well. He was strict, his presence commanding, yet fair. I never expected kindness from him, but he offered guidance in a way that was different from the other officers. He challenged me, pointing out weaknesses I didn't even see in myself, and then taught me how to turn them into strengths. He spoke about leadership, patience, and controlling emotions under pressure. His lessons went beyond textbooks. They were about reading people, understanding situations, and making decisions when stakes were high. Through him, I began to understand the kind of person I could become, a man who remained steady when everything else around him was chaotic. Meanwhile, my parents continued their distant involvement in my life. Birthday cards arrived, always filled with updates about Brielle, her trophies, awards, and the endless celebrations of her achievements. Each card reminded me of the life they had stolen from me, but instead of breaking me, it fueled my determination. I didn't respond, didn't complain, and didn't show them that it hurt. I let my work and discipline speak for me, quietly building skills and resilience they could never see or appreciate. By the end of my first year, I had found a rhythm. The academy was harsh, unforgiving, and exhausting, but it taught me who I was. I wasn't anyone's burden, and I didn't need permission to excel. I had allies I could trust, mentors who pushed me to grow, and the discipline to turn every hardship into an advantage. What started as punishment slowly became preparation for independence, for success, and for the life I intended to build on my own terms. The lessons from Ironwood Summit stayed with me long after I left its walls. Every early morning, every long night of study, every drill that pushed me beyond my limits had shaped a mindset that refused to quit. When I earned a full ROTC scholarship to a state university for computer engineering, I knew this was another battlefield. The competition was fierce, the workload intense, and the hours unforgiving. I balanced 2 jobs to cover my living expenses, surviving on little sleep and even less comfort. Every assignment, every project, every test was another opportunity to prove that I could rise above the circumstances my family had forced upon me. I rarely allowed myself to think of home. My parents had made their choice, and I had no reason to waste energy longing for approval that would never come. Instead, I immersed myself in coding, algorithms, and the complex puzzles of computer systems. Nights blurred into mornings as I debugged programs, wrote papers, and trained with ROTC. The discipline I had learned at Ironwood Summit became my secret weapon. While other students faltered under pressure, I thrived. I knew how to plan, how to execute, and how to endure without complaint. One day, I ran into an old high school friend who casually mentioned that Brielle had flamed out during her freshman year. A knee injury had sidelined her athletic career, and partying and poor grades had ended her university journey before it really began. My parents had kept it all from me, carefully preserving the illusion of her perfect path. I felt no satisfaction in hearing it. Brielle's struggles were not a victory to savor. They were simply a confirmation of what I had suspected all along, that their golden dreams were built on fragile illusions. Instead of rejoicing, a quiet, steely determination settled deeper in my chest. I promised myself that I would build something lasting, something unshakable, something entirely my own. I threw myself into every challenge, every assignment, every shift at work, and every ROTC training session. Sleep was scarce, leisure non-existent, but my focus never wavered. I refused distractions, refused to dwell on past betrayals, and refused to let my parents' choices dictate the limits of my life. Every small success felt like another brick in a fortress I was constructing, a life that would be defined solely by my effort and skill. When I finally walked across the stage at graduation, diploma in hand, I wasn't just a young man with a degree. I was the result of years of relentless effort, of lessons learned in hardship, of resilience forged in solitude. I had built my foundation in silence, and the world now recognized I had achieved something my parents could never take away, something they had tried to deny me, and I had done it entirely on my own terms. The ascent had been quiet, but it was complete. After graduation, Jax and I took the skills we had learned at Ironwood Summit and applied them in the world of technology. We started small, a modest office with just a few computers, but every decision was calculated. We focused on cybersecurity, targeting government and corporate contracts that others overlooked. Our work had to be precise, reliable, and above all, secure. Mistakes were not an option, and reputation was everything. Slowly, our name began to carry weight. I found that the discipline I had gained through years of strict routines gave me an edge. Planning, anticipating problems, and thinking several steps ahead became second nature. Jax shared the same determination, and together we became a team others could trust. We spent long nights coding, testing, and building systems that clients could rely on without question. Every successful contract increased our credibility, and every challenge sharpened our skills. The work was demanding, but I had never felt more capable. It was during these years that I met Elena. She was brilliant, not just with programming, but in understanding people and projects. Unlike anyone from my past, she saw me as I was, not as the boy my parents had dismissed. Her insight and support became invaluable. We worked side by side, building our company from the ground up, and over time, she became more than a partner in business. She became my partner in life. Together, we expanded the firm carefully, never overreaching, always focusing on the strength of our foundation. Within 5 years, our company, Sentinel Core, had grown into a respected enterprise. Multi-million-dollar contracts flowed in, and the firm earned a reputation for excellence and trustworthiness. We had built something that could not be ignored, something that reflected not just skill, but determination, discipline, and strategy. While I took satisfaction in this success, I kept my focus sharp, knowing that the past I had endured was never far behind in memory. Curiosity led me to hire a private investigator. The information that came back shocked me, but did not surprise me. My father's business was struggling, weighed down by debt and continued support of Brielle's aimless life. Years of privilege had left them unprepared, fragile, and vulnerable. While my parents had once held control over my future, the roles had now reversed. I had built an empire in silence while they had squandered the opportunities I had been denied. The knowledge of their struggles strengthened my resolve. Every project we completed, every client we secured, became a quiet confirmation of what I had achieved without their help. I wasn't seeking revenge through words or confrontation. My success was my message, the proof that their decisions had not destroyed me, but had instead shaped me into someone they could never overlook, someone whose achievements now cast a long shadow over the very family that had tried to erase him. The evening of the charity gala felt electric, the room buzzing with conversation and clinking glasses. Veterans and donors mingled, sharing stories and laughter, while I stood beside Elena and Jax, observing the crowd with a quiet satisfaction. Our company, Sentinel Corps, had helped sponsor the event, and the atmosphere reflected years of careful work, dedication, and strategy. Everything about the night felt controlled, purposeful, and polished, much like the life I had built from scratch. As I moved through the room, a flash of recognition caught my eye. Across the polished floor, my parents stood awkwardly, trying to engage donors while keeping appearances. Time had aged them, lines etched into their faces, shoulders slightly slumped under the weight of years and mistakes. Brielle hovered nearby, wrapped in designer clothing, carrying herself as if nothing had changed, yet her expression betrayed emptiness. She was exactly as I had imagined after years of hearing fragments through the grapevine, a hollow version of the prodigy my parents had worshipped. When our eyes met, the moment stretched. My father froze mid-conversation, his confident mask cracking. For a brief second, recognition faltered. He didn't see the boy they had shipped off, the inconvenient child they had discarded. He saw someone entirely different, a man radiating calm authority, quiet power, and success they had never imagined I could achieve. The shock in his eyes was subtle but undeniable, a flicker of realization that he had misjudged everything. Brielle, standing close, shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension and the history between us. I offered a small nod, deliberate and cold, a gesture that carried all the weight of years spent overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. It was not a greeting, not an apology, not an invitation. It was acknowledgement, silent, precise, and complete. The nod conveyed everything they needed to understand without a single word. I was no longer the child they controlled. I was the man they could not manipulate, the one whose life they had underestimated. Without another glance, I turned away, leaving my parents frozen in a mixture of disbelief, regret, and humiliation. Their attempts to network and appear composed crumbled beneath the quiet power of my presence. They had entered the room expecting nothing, but now they confronted the reality of what they had lost, the potential they had squandered, the child they had cast aside, and the man who now stood across from them, untouchable in success and unshakable in confidence. As I returned to Elena and Jax, the gala continued around us, vibrant and lively, but my attention had shifted entirely. I carried with me the knowledge that the first confrontation had already taken place, not through words, arguments, or drama, but through the undeniable truth of presence, achievement, and quiet dominance. In that room, I was unassailable, and they were forced to reckon with a reality they had never anticipated. The boy they discarded had grown into a man they could neither ignore nor surpass. A week after the gala, my office phone rang. The voice on the other end was hesitant, faltering, coded in embarrassment and urgency. It was my father. He spoke carefully, each word weighed, as if testing whether I would even answer. He had somehow caught wind of Sentinel Corps' growth, the reputation we had built in silence. His voice cracked slightly when he mentioned his failing business, mounting debts, and the bank's relentless calls. Then he made the offer, clumsy, awkward, almost pitiful. A consulting contract he hoped I would accept, as if it could erase years of neglect. I let him speak, listening without interruption, letting every word settle. There was no rush to respond, no sign that I was eager to forgive or forget. Instead, I felt a quiet satisfaction building, the kind that comes from watching the people who once dismissed you stumble into the reality of your success. Finally, I spoke, calm and measured. I invited them to my penthouse office, the place that symbolized everything I had built from the ground up. I didn't explain why. I let the anticipation hang in the air. Then I added a final note, deliberate and sharp: bring Brielle. I want to see the star athlete whose future was so bright it required burning mine. The words hung between us like a silent accusation. I imagined their faces, the sudden awareness that the boy they had tried to discard had become the man now holding the power. I didn't need to yell or demand respect. The arrangement itself, the invitation under my terms, made it clear who held control. The call ended, leaving a quiet tension that I relished, a reminder that patience and strategy could accomplish far more than anger ever would. I spent the days leading up to the meeting preparing, not papers or contracts, but my mind. I rehearsed nothing, yet felt every interaction in advance. How they would react to the environment, to the view from my office, to the subtle evidence of my success surrounding them. These thoughts sharpened my focus. Every piece of art, every award, every sleek line of design in my penthouse reflected years of work, resilience, and independence, all silently asserting what I had achieved alone. When the day arrived, I would see them not as parents, but as figures in a play whose story I now controlled. Every word they spoke, every hesitation, every faltering explanation would reinforce the reality they had ignored for years. The meeting wasn't about money or business, it was about recognition, about confronting the consequences of their choices. For the first time, the dynamic was reversed. I was no longer the one who needed guidance, resources, or approval. They had come seeking assistance, standing in the shadow of a life I had built from nothing, and I would ensure they understood the full weight of what they had lost. The stage was set. I had orchestrated every detail quietly, precisely, without emotion, letting strategy guide my hand. And soon, they would face me, not as a boy they could control, but as a man whose patience, skill, and success had become an unshakable force. The day of the meeting arrived, and my penthouse office felt like a fortress of everything I had built. Light reflected off the polished surfaces, awards and contracts neatly displayed, a silent testament to years of work, sacrifice, and discipline. My parents stepped in first, their posture stiff, their eyes darting nervously around the room. Brielle followed, dressed immaculately, but her expression tense, the emptiness I had imagined evident in her every movement. I invited them to sit, offering nothing more than a polite nod. My father began immediately, trying to pitch ideas, suggest solutions, and regain some semblance of authority. His voice was tentative, unsteady, and I listened without interruption. My mother's tears came next, quiet at first, then spilling as she whispered that they had done what they thought was best. Brielle remained silent, arms crossed, her face tight with anger and embarrassment. The room carried a weight, a mixture of shame and anticipation, and I let it settle, letting them feel the tension without speaking a word. Once they had exhausted their attempts to explain, I began. I spoke slowly, deliberately, not with anger but with precision. I laid out what I knew, facts that could not be denied: Brielle's dropout, her failed surgeries, the debts my parents had accumulated trying to maintain an illusion of success. I named the details, each one a quiet hammer striking home. I didn't raise my voice, didn't shout or scold, the truth alone was enough. Each revelation landed with the weight of inevitability, exposing the cracks they had tried to hide, the failures they had carefully buried. I observed their reactions without comment, allowing every expression to register: shock, regret, disbelief, and finally, a dawning understanding that their choices had consequences beyond what they had ever imagined. When the moment reached its peak, I placed a single, sealed envelope on the table. Its presence was deliberate, symbolic, a culmination of every plan, every careful calculation, every year spent preparing for this moment. I didn't explain its contents. I didn't need to. Its meaning was clear. The control they thought they held, the power they believed they commanded, had shifted entirely. This envelope contained the terms of accountability, the facts they had tried to hide, and the authority I now possessed over my own life and their acknowledgement of it. The room was silent, heavy with unspoken realizations. They had come expecting assistance, perhaps reconciliation, or a chance to regain a foothold. Instead, they faced a calm, calculated reckoning, a reflection of every misstep, every misjudgment, and every opportunity they had squandered. In that quiet, tense space, I didn't need to raise my voice, wave my hands, or force recognition. The truth alone was sufficient. And when I finally looked up from the envelope, the weight of years of planning, endurance, and silent growth pressed down, leaving them small, exposed, and entirely at my mercy. I slid the envelope across the table, watching their hands tremble as they reached for it. They hesitated, unsure, aware that what lay inside was far more than a simple gesture. It wasn't a check, it wasn't an apology, and it certainly wasn't forgiveness. It was a contract clear, precise, and unyielding. The terms were simple, yet carried the full weight of everything they had tried to deny me. I would settle their primary mortgage in one lump sum, saving them from financial collapse, but in return, they would sign a binding document. This document would acknowledge, in writing, their betrayal, the way they had taken my college fund, how they had sent me to Ironwood Summit like I was a burden to be discarded. I watched their eyes widen as they realized the implications. The contract required them to publicly accept the truth I had endured in silence for years. No excuses, no softening of words. They would surrender any right to speak for me, about me, or ask me for anything ever again. The choice was theirs, but the terms were final. I made no threats, offered no persuasion. This was not about anger. It was about clarity, fairness, and reclaiming what had been stolen. I wanted them to understand that accountability was not negotiable. My father's hands shook slightly as he touched the envelope. My mother's tears fell quietly, but they did not soften her expression. Brielle's lips pressed tight, a mixture of defiance and realization settling over her. I let the silence stretch, giving them space to absorb the weight of what I had laid before them. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain further. The meaning was obvious. They had spent years controlling, judging, and dismissing me, but now the control had shifted. The power to determine the terms of engagement rested solely in my hands. I thought about every year of effort, every sleepless night, every challenge I had overcome while they turned their attention elsewhere. This contract represented more than a legal agreement. It symbolized my independence, my ability to define the relationship on my terms, and the boundaries I had established after years of betrayal. Signing it would be their only way to reclaim stability, but at the cost of admitting their failure. Finally, I spoke softly, the words deliberate. This is the only arrangement. It protects you and frees me. Sign it, or face the consequences of your choices. I watched them exchange glances, the weight of truth pressing down, and slowly, carefully, they understood that this was not punishment. It was justice, measured and exact, granting me permanent freedom and ensuring they could no longer interfere in my life. The envelope sat between us, heavy with the quiet power of accountability, and the room filled with the finality of what had been set in motion. Their faces changed the moment they understood what the contract meant. The shock was clear, real, sharp, and impossible for them to hide. My mother's hand covered her mouth, and my father leaned back as if the air had been knocked out of him. The idea of admitting their betrayal in writing, in their own words, was something they had never expected to confront. The thought of others knowing the truth unsettled them far more than the financial crisis they were drowning in. They tried to push back at first. My father attempted to sound firm, though his voice wavered. He spoke of family, of misunderstandings, of moving forward. My mother pleaded softly, hoping emotion would sway me. Brielle muttered under her breath, angry but powerless. They tried every angle, excuses, guilt, even half-hearted promises of change. But I remained steady, watching their desperation grow with each passing minute. I repeated what needed to be said, calm and direct. This is the only deal. Accept it, or lose everything. You taught me to be practical, now I'm following your lesson. There was no anger in my tone, only certainty. Their reactions, their bargaining, their sudden attempt to rewrite history. None of it moved me. I had spent too many years carrying the weight of their choices. Now, they had to carry their own. My words forced them to look at the situation clearly. Their business was collapsing. Their debts were climbing. The bank was preparing to take their home. Without my help, they would face consequences far harsher than a written admission. They knew it, even if they did not want to accept it. Silence settled again, heavy and tense. My father finally closed his eyes, letting out a long breath, as if surrendering to something inevitable. My mother wiped her tears, but said nothing more. Brielle looked away, unable to meet my gaze. They all realized that refusing meant losing everything. Signing meant facing a truth they had tried to bury for years. At last, my father picked up the pen. His hand shook slightly as he placed his signature on the document. My mother followed, her movements slow, almost resigned. Brielle signed without a word. When it was done, the contract sat between us, binding and final. I collected the papers, sealed them, and placed them in the safe behind my desk. The sound of the lock clicking shut marked the end of an era. The moment the balance of power shifted permanently, I wired the money immediately, fulfilling my part without hesitation. Their home was saved, but the cost had been their pride, their excuses, and the illusion of control they once held over me. As they stood to leave, none of them could look me in the eye for long. They walked out quietly, carrying the weight of a truth they could no longer ignore. For the first time in my life, I felt the full strength of my independence. The past no longer held me. I held it. The moment the contract was signed, I felt a weight lift, though the final act of revenge wasn't in its execution, but in its quiet existence. I didn't need to show the world what they had admitted. The truth, now locked safely in my possession, was enough. The power lay not in public exposure, but in knowing they understood what I could do and chose not to resist. It was the ultimate balance, silent and complete. With that chapter closed, I turned to building something meaningful. I established a foundation in Major Vance's name, honoring the man who had guided me through the hardest years of my life. The foundation provided scholarships for children overlooked, abandoned, or dismissed by those who should have cared. Every successful student, every child given a chance, was a small victory, a quiet way to turn my pain into purpose. It reminded me that real strength wasn't just about winning over those who wronged you. It was about lifting others as you rise. Elena remained by my side through every step. Her support, insight, and unwavering belief in me became a foundation of its own, one that matched the strength I had forged in silence. When we decided to marry, Jack stood as my best man, a constant reminder of loyalty, shared struggle, and the friendships that had survived years of hardship. Surrounded by the people who mattered, who had seen me grow into myself, I felt a peace I hadn't known before. The life I had built was no longer a response to betrayal, but a reflection of all I had worked for, independently, carefully, and deliberately. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived, simple, handwritten, and unexpected. My mother's words were few. "You were always the strong one. We were blind." I read it slowly, letting each sentence sink in. For the first time, the pain of their choices felt distant, like a ghost that had finally passed. I didn't need her acknowledgement to feel whole, but it was a small, quiet closure nonetheless. I placed the letter in the fireplace and watched it burn, the embers consuming the last remnants of a life shaped by neglect, betrayal, and discarded dreams. As the fire crackled, I turned to Elena, took her hand, and smiled. The past no longer dictated my life. I was free, surrounded by love, guided by purpose, and fully in control of my legacy. My strength, my choices, and the life I had built were now mine entirely. Peace was no longer something I chased. It was something I lived. I chose to cut ties and build my own life after years of being overlooked and betrayed. Was it the right move, or should I have tried to forgive them? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like mine.